Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
Tonight, diplomatic duo. In Geneva, U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner reach a general agreement with Tehran on nuclear principles, while also facilitating talks between Russia and Ukraine. Those discussions resume Wednesday.
Back in Washington is a DHS funding impasse. 4 days now into a partial government shutdown, negotiators are still stuck. Democrats have sent the counteroffer to the White House, but there's no sign of a breakthrough. Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi joins us soon with the latest on talks.
Also, the midterm primary season is here. Early voting now underway in Texas. We'll take a closer look at the high-stakes battle for a key U.S. Senate seat and why President Trump says he's not endorsing a candidate yet.
And gross mismanagement. A busted sewer pipe is wreaking havoc on D.C. area waterways, and the president is turning it into another political flashpoint. Trump says Democratic officials are responsible, demanding they act fast before the damage spreads. But we begin this evening with the dueling meetings today in Geneva, one between the U.S. and Iran, the other between Russia and Ukraine, brokered by U.S. officials. Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan joins us now from the White House North Lawn with all the details on this. Kate, it's hard to tell exactly what happened in these meetings other than the fact that we know they've concluded. We've still received no official readout from the White House on either, right?
That's right. So the White House is saying that on the Iran talks, we don't have a readout yet for the Ukraine talks, but that on Iran, that progress was made, but that there are still a lot of details to discuss. And we actually heard the vice president go a bit further in an interview with Fox News today. He said that in some ways the talks did go well, but that in other ways that it's clear that the Iranians, he said, are not willing to acknowledge or work through some of the red lines that the president has put forward. Now, the only red line that we've really heard articulated by the president and this White House is that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. We still don't know really the scope of the negotiations, which is important because the Iranians wanted to keep it very narrowly focused on just the nuclear talks, and the U.S. wanted to put other things on the table, like Iran's ballistic missile program, for example. And of course, Joe, this is happening amid the backdrop of the U.S. is amassing more and more military power in the region, and the threat of a potential U.S. strike on Iran is definitely looming large over these talks.
Well, certainly, and that's just one set of talks, Kate. Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff certainly were busy today. They'll be busy again tomorrow, specifically brokering the talks for a second day between Russia and Ukraine. Do we have a sense, given the remarks we've heard from President Trump expressing frustration with Ukraine specifically, as to why that is the side he currently seems to have less patience with?
It's a great question. I think we've heard the president, sort of shift his position a lot throughout the months of these negotiations. I've been told that the talks today on Ukraine have wrapped. We don't have a readout yet. Territory was expected to be a main part of the discussions today. As you know, this has been a long-standing issue. Russia wants to have land that it does not control, and Ukraine is saying that that is simply unacceptable. We have heard the president express more frustration with Ukraine in recent days and saying that Zelensky is the one that needs to make concessions here, despite Russia being the one who invaded Ukraine. And we're coming up on the 4-year anniversary of that invasion.
Yep, it's a week from today, the same day as President Trump's State of the Union address. Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan reporting from the White House North Lawn. Thank you so much. And joining us now with more is Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, who serves on both the House China Select and House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. If we could begin first with Iran, because obviously we have seen President Trump authorize the use of force in Iran before in June, after he had said he would decide within 2 weeks. It was 3 days later that Operation Midnight Hammer came down without forewarning to the Gang of Eight or the Intelligence Committee on which you sit. If he decides to move on Iran this time, if there is no deal, do you expect you will be forewarned?
I'm not sure about that. I think their modus operandi is they don't really seem to respect the War Powers Act, and they don't seem to inform Congress before they take these actions, but they must. And here's why. The War Powers Act was put in place a long time ago, especially in the early 1970s after the Vietnam War, because the American people did not want secret wars. They didn't want violence done in their name. They didn't want armed forces deployed in active hostilities without their consent. And so that is what we're looking at here. I'm concerned that we're going to potentially end up in another war in the Middle East. We don't want that. The American people don't want that. And that's something that comes out loud and clear. All that being said, Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. It cannot have a nuclear weapon. And I'm glad that there's negotiations also with regard to ending their ballistic missile program and their nefarious activities in the region. But let's do it diplomatically. Let's negotiate this diplomatically in concert with our friends, partners, and allies.
Well, when Secretary Rubio, Congressman, was asked in congressional testimony about why no one got a heads up, particularly those on the Intel Committee like yourself, he said because the Maduro capture was a trigger-based operation. Do you suspect the answer would be the same about strikes against Iran? Would you be briefed in advance of that action?
I don't see the words trigger-based operation as an exception in the War Powers Act. And as a consequence, I would expect that we would be warned. Obviously, in an emergency situation, the President of the United States has the prerogative to defend our country, and that's a special situation. But where there is no emergency in the sense of the word as it's described in the War Powers Act or elsewhere, he needs to come to us. He needs to advise us. And of course, if he's going to deploy armed forces in any way, then he needs to get our consent, the consent of the American people.
Well, from your purview on the Intelligence Committee, but also the China Select Committee, when we consider the president and the administration's focus here, is he right to be focusing on the nuclear capabilities of Iran on the Middle East, specifically deploying resources to that region at the expense, perhaps, of having a greater American footprint elsewhere in the Asia-Pacific, for example? I just wonder if you see the president's priorities align with your own when you think about the vast geopolitical landscape under consideration.
I'm much more concerned about the Indo-Pacific region, quite frankly. I'm more concerned about the Chinese Communist Party and their economic, military, and technological aggression than I am about some other theaters. And I'm concerned that taking away assets potentially from those areas, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, but also the European theater, basically is a gift to our adversaries. And when you show weakness and you lower your deterrence, then you invite aggression. And of course, aggression can spark conflict and lead to war. And so that is my overall concern about the Trump administration's foreign policy. It's not about deterrence as much as, making other performative statements, and that lowers our deterrence and could invite war.
Congressman, I want to ask you about the partial shutdown that we're now 4 days into here. And to Kayleigh's point, a State of the Union address that is scheduled for a week from tonight. Before we address the contours of this debate, it doesn't sound like anything has changed since lawmakers left town. Is it appropriate for President Trump to be addressing a joint session of Congress with a portion of the government closed?
Look, I think that it's probably okay to do that. But at the same time, he's got to acknowledge that the American people are not happy with DHS. They have rejected the policies of ICE and CBP. Here in Chicago, they have basically terrorized neighborhoods. He said he was going to come after the worst of the worst. Instead, he separated families, and he basically uprooted communities of peaceful people. And so I think the American people want to see how he's going to completely change what's happening at DHS. And in the meantime, I'm not going to vote to send a single dollar to fund ICE or DHS or CBP right now unless and until some common sense changes are made immediately.
Well, so let's walk through some of those common sense changes that you and your leadership are seeking, Congressman. We know masks has been a sticking point. Judicial warrants seems to be something that Republicans are not willing to budge on either. In the absence of compromise on those issues, how do we get out of this if you aren't willing to send another dollar to the Department of Homeland Security if those things don't change?
Well, I think that they're going to hear from the American people more and more about these particular issues because, as you know, unfortunately, those ICE and CBP operations may resume. And they may actually come back to places like Chicago, which are already traumatized by what happened previously. I got to tell you, like, the mask situation is just common sense. This is something that our local law enforcement has to abide by. They don't wear masks, they wear ID, they wear body cams, they don't do warrantless arrests, and there are third-party investigations of the use of force, and they're not roving around town trying to stir up trouble the same way that Greg Bovino of the CBP was when he was here in Chicago. And so this is like stuff that I think the American people feel is reasonable. It's just what local law enforcement would abide by, and same with CBP and ICE.
Well, you know what a lot of Republican lawmakers tell us, Congressman, and I'm sure we're going to hear this a little bit later this hour from Ken Cuccinelli, is that it's different in this case because these officers are being targeted. They're being doxxed. There is, in fact, an organized effort through signal chats and other forums to try to out these members' identities and their families so they can be targeted at home. How would you respond to that?
Well, look, I think that no member of law enforcement should be treated in such a way if they're performing their duties or, they should not be targeted in this way. Nobody should be. Yeah. However, masks are basically enabling these folks to act in a way that is unaccountable to the American people. In my own area, in my district, they basically snatched an 18-year-old U.S. citizen from her vehicle, tackled her to the ground. They knelt on her knee with their neck, they knelt on her neck with their knee as she was screaming, "I'm a U.S. citizen, I'm a U.S. citizen." That family came to us and said, "Where did they take my daughter?" And as a father of three, I was horrified. Later on, they only found the daughter when they produced the papers that she was a U.S. citizen. This is completely unacceptable. This should not be happening in the United States of America. And this is why, we are so insistent that some basic standards and requirements must be met.
Well, Congressman, finally, as we look for some degree of transparency as to whether or not we're getting closer to finding agreement on some of those elements, what are you hearing currently from Democratic leadership, from Hakeem Jeffries, as to what communication is currently underway, though you and your colleagues are not in Washington, between negotiators and the White House? Can we get a sense of, even if, Capitol Hill is pretty much empty at this point, how these efforts are working at this time? Well,
my understanding is that there's some text that's being exchanged back and forth, and I understand that some text was exchanged even as late as late yesterday. I don't know the status on the negotiations of that text, but the initial readout, as far as I was told, was not very satisfactory in terms of the Republican response. And so there's probably a ways to go at this point if we had to be candid about it. But I got to tell you, my constituents are livid about CBP and ICE. And, I'm an immigrant myself, so this is a personal issue for me and not just a professional one. And it's something that I think a lot of people are paying attention to right now.
It's good to have you back, Congressman. Thank you. Democrat Roger Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, live on Bloomberg. Wall Street managed to shake morning losses for a modestly higher finish today, with the S&P 500 closing up about 0.25%. But there are still big questions about the impact of AI on software companies, and we may be getting some answers in the after-hours session by way of cybersecurity company Palo Alto Networks, out with quarterly results. Doesn't look like investors are happy. For more, we turn to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick in New York. What do you have, Romaine?
Yeah, unfortunately, if you're looking for answers, Joe, you're just kind of getting a muddled picture here, and it kind of adds to a lot of the anxiety going on. Remember, if we had this conversation a year ago, heck, even 3 or 4 months ago here, I think you would see a little bit more enthusiasm out of investors, not so much for what's happening in the short term, but the idea of the long-term AI infrastructure play. That's been under pressure for quite some time. It's a big part of the reason why the broader market, the S&P, the NASDAQ, which had coming off one of its worst weeks of the year last week, starting this week on a down note as well. A holiday shortened week. We did see some dip buying midday, but on the whole, most of the indices ended the day flat on the day. You really got no help from the Mag 7. 3 of those names were higher on the day, led primarily by Apple with a 3% gain. But most of the other names were deep in the red. Most of the other big tech stocks also in the red, and that included software stocks. Take a look at the IGV. That's the main ETF that tracks some of the biggest software stocks out there. It has been deep in a bear market now for weeks, and it started the week off really nowhere different. A lot of concerns here about the potential disruption for a lot of those names in that indice, continuing to rattle investors, looking for some clues here, not so much as to whether the AI spending will continue, but exactly how that's being distributed. Who are the winners and losers? And you can ask 10 people, Joe, who the winners or losers are going to be, and you'll probably get 8 or 9 different answers. There was some activity outside of the software and tech space, and that involves the drama over Warner Brothers Discovery, Netflix, Paramount, Skydance, Joe, earlier today, basically saying it's war. They are going to continue to go after Warner Brothers Discovery, asking for an extension from Warner Brothers Discovery shareholders to continue finding some way around that bid. You did see a big bump in shares of Paramount, Skydance, Joe and Kaylee, up about 5%.
Well, so certainly some interesting action within the equity market. Romain, I'd like to also ask you about commodities as we began our show talking about whether or not there was real progress in negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. How are we seeing that reflected in oil?
Yeah, you had seen a bump up in oil, more than 10%, going off of kind of mid to late December, heading into the beginning of February because of concerns here about potential conflict, military conflict with Iran. That started to ease just a little bit over the last few days, including today, where we did get a report here that there may actually be some degree of constructive talk, some degree of constructive progress, I should say. The idea here that at a bare minimum, the military options, or at least any sort of extreme military options, might be off the table. Again, it's hard to really suss out exactly, Kaylee, where this goes next. But that premium, that geopolitical premium that had been priced into crude prices, that at least right now seems to be taken off the table. But who knows what tomorrow may bring, Kaylee. We'll have to keep an eye on this here. Investors kind of playing it safe right now here, leaving WTI crude right around $62 a barrel.
All right, Bloomberg's Romain Bostic, thank you so much. Still ahead, we'll have more on the Department of Homeland Security shutdown and potential reforms to ICE with former Acting DHS Secretary Ken Cuccinelli. And what's behind New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani's proposal to raise property taxes for the first time in more than 2 decades? That's ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
If the Republicans refused any of these crackdowns on the way ICE is operating, it's going to be hard to come to a deal. The public is with the Democrats on this. All the polling shows that the public thinks that these ICE characters should follow the same rules as regular law enforcement. That's all that we're asking, and the public agrees with that.
Democratic Congresswoman Dina Titus of Nevada on the early edition of Balance of Power today on Bloomberg TV and radio on what is the 4th day of a partial government shutdown, specifically of the Department of Homeland Security, as Democrats and the White House struggle to come to an agreement on reforms to ICE to unlock funding for the department. Joining us now for more is Ken Cuccinelli, former Acting Deputy DHS Secretary in the first Trump administration. He's now national chair of the Election Transparency Initiative. Mr. Cuccinelli, thank you for being with us. As we consider, and I'm sure you heard the conversation we just had with Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi about what Democrats are describing as common sense reforms to ICE that they would like to see in order to get DHS funded once again. Can you explain to us why these asks are difficult? What would be wrong with needing to have a judicial warrant or to not be able to wear a mask like other law enforcement officers? Why is this so hard to agree to?
Well, first of all, other law enforcement officers do sometimes wear masks when they're under the conditions that ICE is operating in. As was mentioned in one of the questions, we've never had, that I can recall, an organized effort by people who've demonstrated a willingness to be violent to target law enforcement officers and their families where they live and while they're operating, not merely protesting, but actually stalking them during the midst of operations, which puts them in both danger and creates danger for the officers themselves. So they are not operating outside the parameters of other law enforcement agencies. It is more that other law enforcement agencies do not typically have to operate in the midst of a political environment that is no fault of the ICE agents, for sure. With respect to the warrants you asked about, keep in mind that about 1.5 million people already have been all the way through the due process process and have orders for removal that they're not obeying. And to go into someone's home, these agents do need a judicial warrant. And when they go into someone's home, they get a judicial warrant. But not to just execute on an already existing court order for removal, one of the 1.5 million that I just described, or emergency removals, for example, for some criminals that get picked up. And of course, none of this would be much trouble, if you will, if the local authorities, particularly with respect to criminals, were cooperating. Mm-hmm. But they both want to stifle ICE in its mission and not cooperate and interfere or get as close to interfering as they can without breaking federal law, and then demand behavioral changes from ICE that no law enforcement agency could ever accede to.
Well, I want to ask you then about a potential off-ramp, and I wonder if it's leadership, something you know a little bit about at the top of DHS. Democrats and even some Republicans have been very critical of Kristi Noem's job here, and one of them is Debbie Wasserman Schultz, of course, the Democratic Congresswoman from Florida. Here's what she had to say.
Kristi Noem is a hot, horrific mess who, if she doesn't get fired or step down herself, needs to be impeached. She has essentially assembled one of the largest agencies in our federal government in service of her own self-promotion and attention is an outrage. And she is singularly incompetent.
Obviously not mincing words, and nor are you. I'm just curious, is there an opportunity here if there's no compromise on masking or warrants? How about a new look at the top at DHS? Would a new secretary help to reopen the department?
Well, that's really a political question. I mean, what Wasserman Schultz said, that she was complaining about Kristi Noem being ineffective. Does anyone watching, you and me, think that Debbie Wasserman Schultz actually wants Trump's Secretary of Homeland Security to be effective at achieving the various missions of the Department of Homeland Security? Obviously not. They've shut it down. So that's all politics. Whether the department could be run better, there's always something you can do to make an improvement. Yeah. But they don't want it to run better. All of the ICE demands, they harken back to the 2021 operational memos at the beginning of the Joe Biden administration, where they literally intentionally reworked the operations of the immigration agencies to impair the achievement of their missions. It's like tying someone's shoelaces together. That's what they consider good operations. So this is not about being effective at achieving the missions that Congress, by the way, set out for ICE and the rest of the Department of Homeland Security. It's about getting Republicans to agree to have DHS operate in ways that won't achieve those missions quite purposely. And that is not something that I see the Republicans, certainly not President Trump, being willing to agree to. And they at least planned ahead enough to have ICE money set aside. This is not shutting ICE down. And the Democrats can't go back even to their radical base and say, hey, we're shutting ICE down. They're not. They're shutting FEMA down. They're shutting USCIS, the legal immigration agency that I used to lead, down.
Well, I wish we had more time to talk about this, and I want you to come back to talk to us about election integrity. Ken Cuccinelli with us live. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. The first votes are being cast in the midterm primary season as Texas joins North Carolina in early voting, with Texas Senator John Cornyn facing his first serious electoral challenge in more than 2 decades. Public polling in Texas has been pretty noisy, but the most recent from the University of Houston shows Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton leading the Republican field by about 7 points. On the Democratic side, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is leading State Rep James Talrico by a similar margin. And if no candidate clears 50%, the primary goes to a runoff in May. Over the weekend, President Trump was asked about who he was endorsing in the Republican primary in this race. Take a listen to his response.
I just haven't made a decision in that race yet. It's got a ways to go, and he's a good man. John is I like all three of them, actually. I like all three. Those are the toughest races. They've all supported me. They're all good, and you're supposed to pick one. So we'll see what happens.
I like all three of them, he says, joining us now with his reaction and insight into this race that's likely to be the most expensive Senate race in the country. Jim Messina, the former campaign manager for President Obama's successful re-election in 2012, Democratic strategist with the Messina Group, of course. Jim, it's great to see you and welcome back. Is there anything more dangerous if you're a Republican candidate in this primary right now than President Trump saying, I love all three of them?
Yeah, if I was the incumbent, if I was John Cornyn, I would not be happy with that answer.
What does that tell you?
That tells me that he's not sure Cornyn can win. And the White House has said, publicly and privately, they want to see if Cornyn can win. The Democrats, Joe, are desperate to have Ken Paxton come out of that primary. He would be the much easier candidate in the general election. But the fact that we're talking about Texas, a state where Democrats haven't won a statewide election since 1994, my senior year in college, I'm now an AARP member, Joe. So this is amazing that we're talking about Texas being in play.
Well, and to your point, Jim, there have been times, including in the last cycle with Senator Ted Cruz's seat, that we've questioned whether or not Texas actually could flip blue, and it hasn't happened. So what realistically would make this time different? Is this literally just a candidate quality question?
I think two things, Kayleigh. I think, first of all, it's a candidate quality question, who the Republican is, who the Democrat is. The second is Donald Trump's numbers. Donald Trump's numbers are really bad in Texas, and if they continue to fall as they're falling all around the country, that could really help in swing voters. As you said, Beto O'Rourke came 2 points away from beating Cruz. Cruz had a tough election last time. Democrats have been talking about Texas going blue forever. It hasn't yet. But the question is if they can come out of this race, with Paxton and a good Democratic nominee, this thing's in play.
Do you believe the conventional wisdom on the Democratic side? This is an uphill primary for Mr. Tallarico, but he stands a better chance of beating a John Cornyn if that, in fact, is the general election matchup?
Well, I'll leave it to the Democrats to decide who their nominee is. But I will tell you that I spent some time with Tallarico recently, and I was stunned by how impressive he was. He had control of a room that reminded me of Bill Clinton. He's able to talk about faith in a really unique way. I've not spent any time with Congresswoman Crockett because she got in the race so late. But I think they both go to sleep hoping they're going to win the primary and that Ken Paxton wins the primary on the Republican side.
Well, so when we consider both James Tallarico and Jasmine Crockett and what messages Democrats across the board will be trying to run on in the midterms as they try to get any kind of power they can back in Washington, Jim, knowing President Trump is going to be resuming his affordability tour this week, heading to Georgia on Thursday, is it the affordability issue in states like Texas as well? Is this going to be a state-by-state conversation, or is all politics actually really national still?
It's really national still, Kayleigh. This is an affordability election. Donald Trump's underwater by 28 points on affordability. Some of that's not his fault. He's just the president of the United States during these tough times. But voters are blaming his party. And when you look at the successful candidates that we had in November in New Jersey and Virginia governor's races, they just lived in the affordability lane. And Democrats win elections when they're in the middle on economic issues. And so I think you're just going to see the Democrats say the word affordability so many times it makes independent analysts like you guys want to throw up. But it is true that that's the only issue that matters for Democrats right now.
I want to ask you about the fallout from Munich. Jim, you're seeing the same reports that we are, to the point where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez picked up the phone and called the New York Times to try to redirect their reporting. It was herself, the congresswoman from New York, as well as Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, who were part of a panel asked about foreign policy by Bloomberg's own Francine Lacroix, and they didn't exactly come up with news-making answers. Let's give our audience a taste. This is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
I think that the United States is very much in a compromised position compared to where we were 5 years ago. Our relationships with our allies are strained, and Our domestic situation, I think, is reflecting globally as well, particularly economically. Skyrocketing inflation, tariffs, of course, have hurt Americans, and it has hurt and had a negative impact on the United States globally as well.
When she was asked about whether the U.S. should defend Taiwan, there wasn't exactly a direct answer. Whitmer had her own issues here when asked about the same thing. Jim, are we looking at the early lineup for 2028? Is that, in fact, why they went to Munich? And how should we interpret their performance?
Well, look, I would say a couple things. The first is that, every senator, governor, and most members of Congress go to sleep at night and wake up in the morning and look at the mirror and see the next president of the United States. I've already met 25 people, Joe, who tell me they're running for president as a Democrat in 2028. They're all starting to get out there. It's healthy for the party. I don't think we need a spokesperson in a midterm election. I think Donald Trump is the person we ought to be running against. And I think all those people, like Gretchen Whitmer, like AOC, other people, should get out there and start road testing ideas and start talking about it. And, they'll stumble, they'll have good moments, they'll have bad moments. I remember Barack Obama going through those same things. But the fact is we all ought to get out there and start to build a message that can win a broad coalition in the presidential.
Maybe a message on alien life, Jim. You knew I had to ask you about this, right? Barack Obama, former President Obama, asked about this in a podcast interview over the weekend, whether he believes or can tell us and confirm that alien life is real. Here's what he said.
Are aliens real?
They're real, but I haven't seen them, and they're not being kept in, what is it?
Area 51.
Area 51.
Jim Messina, did he talk to you about this? and do you know where they are being held?
So, Joe, this is a great story. So I was his deputy chief of staff on the first day he was in office. And afterwards, we came back and I'm like, hey, are you going to get to learn whether they're aliens? And he laughed. And we were in the middle of the economic crisis. He's like, Messina, I got a little bigger things to worry about. And I'm like, no, but you got to ask. And so it was a very funny moment on the first day that Barack Obama became president of the United States.
Can't get a straight answer out of anybody around here.
Yeah, that wasn't a no.
Oh, sorry.
Where are
There's
they?
no aliens,
We're going to have to.
There's no aliens. Don't worry.
None whatsoever. All right. Heard it straight from Jim Messina. Jim, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, Democratic strategist and former Barack Obama campaign manager. We appreciate it. We want to turn now to shares of Palo Alto Networks. They're falling pretty hard post-market after the company gave a disappointing earnings forecast, down about 7.5% right now. Bloomberg tech host Ed Ludlow is joining us from San Francisco to bring us a special conversation with Palo Alto CEO Nikesh Arora. Ed?
Yeah, Kaylee, it's great to see you back, and thank you very much. And Nikesh, I think we get right into the numbers, right? The situation is full-year EPS guidance come down, revenue is beaten, and so I'm trying to understand, the environment that you're in. What is it that's weighing on profitability for the balance of this year?
Well, first of all, nice to see you, Ed, and thank you for having me on. I think the market is not paying attention to our numbers carefully. We just completed our largest acquisition in CyberArk. We had a great quarter. Our numbers are across every known consensus metric. The market is not understanding that our guidance for the next 2 quarters includes CyberArk. If you take the consensus of CyberArk and ours, we're actually getting above the collective consensus, but the market hasn't understood the dilution of shares, so I think they have it wrong. Our guides are actually above consensus across the board. I said our guides are above consensus across the board. These are the post-market bots which haven't figured this out.
I always enjoy you joining us on the network. You're always honest. You're always very specific about M&A, right? The math that people are doing is the guide for next-gen ARR growth is 53 to 54%, CyberArk, Chronosphere. But that would suggest that organically growth is nearer to sort of 20%. Can you see the math that they're doing?
Yes, I see the math, but I think if they listen carefully, CyberArk computes ARR differently from us.
Okay.
So we've had to strip out a few $100 million of CyberArk ARR. Hence, if you take that out and add it back, we're actually doing better collectively than we were guided. This will all clarify by tomorrow morning as the market opens. But I think the market hasn't understood the comments our CFO made around the fact that our computation of ARR is different. It's more conservative than CyberArk. CyberArk's is more aggressive than ours. If you turn their ARR down to the way we compute it. Actually, collectively, our ARR guidance is in excess of what we previously guided organically, individually.
On the call, you mentioned a 9-figure Chronosphere deal. You didn't name the customer. Somebody from the sell side asked you about the deal. They didn't ask you to name the customer. Who's the customer, Nikesh?
It's a popular LLM out there. I think more importantly, what is there to understand is that Chronosphere is a net new startup. They came up with a new way of doing observability, which is much more cost effective, much more efficient, and can scale to the volume that LLMs are putting out there. That's the reason we bought the company. The fact that 250 engineers can build something so amazing that provides a leapfrog opportunity against current players in observability, that's what we bought them for. They have been under test for many months with this LLM. They have fully been accepted across the platform. They will be replacing an incumbent vendor. And as that continues to grow, we expect to see continued growth of ARR for that one customer. But additionally, obviously, Chronosphere is talking to a whole bunch of net new customers who are looking for either get off their do-it-yourself observability platforms or replace expensive observability platforms that they've subscribed to in the past.
Nikesh, like observability is so core to what is happening in agentic right now. If we move on the assumption that the customer is one of the key frontier labs, would you just talk a little bit about why they came to you for security rather than do security themselves? That I know that might sound like a silly question, but actually, you know, a lot of the frontier labs have teams, right? They're looking at this issue themselves. They see value clearly in what Palo Alto Networks is offering.
Well, remember, observability is beyond the model, right? The model, LLM people are focused on making sure their model is amazing. It does all the things that you expect it to do. But observability is to look at it from an end-to-end perspective to see how do they make sure that the customers of theirs who are using these things and the usage continues to double almost every quarter, how do they make sure that all their systems are low latency, are working perfectly, and there's nothing in the entire end-to-end delivery chain that is underperforming. So that's what observability does. The reason they're coming to us is because they're busy building the best models, applying their AI research to the models. We're busy with Chronosphere making sure that the end-to-end proposition works and there is very low latency. By the way, this is true for not just LLM. This is true for every consumer app there is out there. Whether you take Uber or DoorDash or YouTube, every one of these has to have an underpinning observability platform to make sure that it's fully available 99.99% of the time, so that because every minute it is not working at the capability and the latency that is required, it is lost revenue.
Nikesh, very quickly, you acquired Koi. The idea is greater visibility into AI threats, but just succinctly, what problem did that solve for you on the team? What are you getting?
Yeah, look, I think if you look at the adoption of AI at the enterprise end, you are seeing tremendous amount of adoption of vibe coding. People are using Claude Code, Cursor, Codex, and many, many open source coding platforms. As they use it, all that action is happening at the endpoint, at the developer laptop. And that's an uncovered area of security. You have to protect that laptop, that endpoint of the developer to ensure that you can deliver code safely and securely. Koi saw the opportunity a year and a half ago. They built a capability. They have some hot people are adopting them across the board. Anyone who's trying to use vibe coding, anybody who's trying to get onto the coding bandwagon, find efficiencies, needs that security at the endpoint. This is different than other endpoint security, both us and other players in the industry sell, called ADR. This is very specific to endpoint security for agentic capability. That's what Koi does. So that's the reason we acquired Koi.
Nikesh Arora, Palo Alto Networks CEO, jumping straight from the earnings call to Bloomberg Television. Really appreciate it. I'm going to send it back to the team in DC.
Great conversation, Ed. Thank you so much. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, who you can catch each weekday alongside Caroline Hyde, Bloomberg Tech, 11 a.m. Eastern, right here on Bloomberg TV. Coming up, how Washington is honoring the legacy of the late civil rights leader, Jesse Jackson. We'll bring you those details and discuss with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. Much more on today's top stories when our political panel joins us up ahead. But first, here are the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. First, New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani is proposing a significant increase in property taxes, but says it's not something he wants to do. The proposed 9.5% hike would take effect in the fiscal year that begins July 1st and would include all of the city's property classes, impacting more than 3 million residential and over 100,000 commercial units. The mayor has framed the potential hike as a last resort to help close a looming budget gap. His first choice is to raise taxes on corporations and high-income earners to generate new revenue, but those changes require approval from the state legislature in Albany.
President Trump is wading into one of the biggest sewage spills in American history, one that started weeks ago in the Potomac River. The president says the spill is a result of gross mismanagement by local Democratic leaders, calling out Maryland's Governor Wes Moore by name. Trump adding that he's directing FEMA to help coordinate the response. FEMA, of course, not getting paid. In a statement, a spokesperson for Moore claimed the federal government is responsible for that sewage pipe where the leak originated.
And Reverend Jesse Jackson, one of the most prominent U.S. civil rights leaders, has died. The Baptist minister and acolyte of Martin Luther King Jr. fought for political and economic justice for minorities and was known as a gifted orator. He was just the second black Democrat to mount a serious campaign for the presidency, running for the nomination in both 1984 and 88. Jackson later earned international attention by winning the release of American hostages held by hostile foreign governments and served as special envoy to Africa under President Bill Clinton, who awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. Jackson's family said he died peacefully, surrounded by his loved ones. He was 84.
Joining us now with their reaction to all of our top stories today, this evening's political panel. Megan Hayes is back with us, Democratic strategist and former special assistant to President Biden. I'm not sure what that just said. Alongside Republican strategist Greta Joins, policy director at Brownstein Hyatt. It's great to have both of you with us. Thanks for being here. Megan, we're 4 days into a partial government shutdown. We're going to try to squeeze in a couple of stories here, and I want to make sure nothing has changed, because as of last week, there were sticking points that don't seem to have budged. Lawmakers are going to return next week, and still nothing will have changed.
Right. Republicans are on recess. They've called recess, and they are not even doing anything to try to fix it. I don't think that Democrats' asks here are unreasonable, and trying to shut down the government or shutting down the government again for asks that are not that unreasonable is it's very interesting. Over 60% of people in a Fox poll said that they want changes to ICE and think that they have gone too far. So the American people are actually calling for some of these changes as well. So it's not just Democrats here. It's all the American people.
Well, to that point, Greta, the polling does actually consistently show that the public seems to be more on the side of Democrats and what they're asking for here than Republicans. Does that not give incentive to Republicans to acquiesce at some point?
Well, I don't necessarily know that the American populace is where Democrats are, which is end all deportations and allow everyone to stay. I do think that
what they're asking for is masking, unmasking more specifically, judicial warrants, things of that nature. It does seem that there is support.
I don't know if the polling has been specific to unmasking. I think there are certainly changes that need to happen at ICE, and I think those changes have already been put in place by Tom Homan and President Trump in Minneapolis, drawing down, moving folks out, and trying to address some of these local concerns. The chaotic nature of what happened in Minneapolis is not beneficial to ICE and or to the citizens that live there. I think everyone can acknowledge that. But I think ultimately trying to create and forge more chaos, which Democratic local leaders were certainly encouraging, at least at the start of some of these protests, is also something that I think we need Democrats to focus on, really trying to bring down some of that temper and have more constructive conversations. I think some of the things that Democrats have put forward to the White House, I think, are manageable, but the broad list is not. And I think we'll hear more about that at the State of the Union next week.
That's a great point that you bring up. President says he's still game for a State of the Union. With an agency closed, is that the right move? I suspect that he's going to use that as a hook to call out Democrats in the chamber.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that a partial government shutdown is going to stop him from doing a State of the Union. The folks are still getting paid.
Maybe it should.
And they are funded. I mean, they're funded through their paychecks actually aren't impacted for several weeks. But I do think that Democrats and Republicans need to come together and negotiate. We saw how this played out when the government shut down before. Asking people to have warrants and taking their masks off are not things that are unreasonable. And so I just think that Republicans are going to pay for this in the midterms. They are already seeing the slide of their popularity dwindle. So if they want to continue to lose more seats, they can go along this path.
Well, so when we consider the messaging we'll get from President Trump at the State of the Union, does he want to be talking about this, knowing that in some sense he's on the defensive when it comes to issues of ICE and the Department of Homeland Security versus things like affordability or touting the economy, things he can go on offense on?
I think he's going to talk about all of it, right? I certainly think that the president and those around him, when they were looking at immigration reform, knew that it was going to be difficult, ultimately, to remove people who do not want to be removed from this country. It's not pleasant, and unfortunately, it's where we have to be. When you import 8% of the population of some of these South American countries into the U.S. in 4 years, that is a really difficult thing to remove all of those people in what the president has, which is 1 4-year term. And so I think the president will certainly talk about that. He ran aggressively on all of these messages and he, I think, is very much looking at completing what he promised to the American people. I think he will talk about the economy, and I think he'll talk about housing, and he'll certainly talk about a lot of the forward-looking and I think very innovative ideas he has moving forward for the rest of his term.
So is next Tuesday the Octagon? I mean, this is going to be wild, right? If we have this little trust, we can't even figure out how to get around this funding standoff. Decorum went out the window years ago in the State of the Union. This is going to be a call and response kind of night, right?
I mean, I just wish everyone would be quiet so it could just get over faster and we could all just go home and go to bed.
Not a chance, Megan.
It's going to be the same nonsense. He's going to get up there and tell a bunch of lies like he always does, and he's going to say things that aren't true, and then everyone's going to rebut it, and then we're going to spend the next 48 hours talking about it. So I just wish everyone would just be quiet, let him get through it, and move on.
Well, of course, it's not the first time we'll hear from President Trump. We're actually going to hear from him on Thursday before the State of the Union. He's heading to Georgia as part of the affordability tour that initially the chief of staff, Susie Wiles, said was going to be a weekly thing. He was going to be running around the country to talk about this message. We have not seen it yet. It seems it's resuming now. Greta, was that a missed opportunity to not have been doing that for the last many weeks? Is he going to have to continue to ramp it up significantly post State of the Union, try to ride some kind of momentum?
I don't think so. I think ultimately finding venues and finding audiences and finding the right messaging that I think ultimately resonates with what the American people are feeling is most important versus doing a specific type of cadence. I think ultimately as we get closer to the midterms, he will certainly be out there on a much more frequent basis. But I think he really wanted to take the time to make sure that he felt comfortable with where they were going. And I think Georgia is a great place to start.
Trying to figure out who's going to be in the First Lady's box for the State of the Union, and who the big invite will be for President Trump. Maybe you have an idea. Who did Democrats bring? Are we going to see a bunch of doctors in lab coats?
No, you're going to see Epstein survivors. They've already announced that there'll be Epstein survivors in the audience. And
wow.
I think that will be the main push.
Can't imagine those interviews after the speech is done. Who should the president bring?
I think
first responders? Is it someone I'm not thinking of?
I think it's going to be probably some first responders. I certainly think there are going to be people who've lost family members to acts of violence here in the United States perpetrated by illegal immigrants. And I think there will be a wide cast of characters.
No kid
Well,
rock.
we have much to look forward to.
Yeah.
I guess you can't rule it out. It's a week from tonight. Megan Hayes and Greta Joins, thank you both so much for joining us. And of course, for more coverage, you can always check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. Back to reality today. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.